Mac! Yeah, it's me again. The work just keeps coming. This time, we need you to help out with a brand awareness campaign for a new lifestyle brand. The company is called VFX, and they're trying to capture the young, hip VFX enthusiast market. We'd like you to work on the Detroit spot. Check out the edit and look at the artwork we sent over. The client wants to see the VFX logo and some of the other assets tracked onto walls, signs, and other surfaces in the spots. Try to make it look like tagging or graffiti. It should feel a little subversive. There's no real direction on how many shots need elements tracked in, so just do what feels right. But the last shot should definitely have the logo. Get after it.
The edit video from the client this time is super basic. I'm getting the feeling they're starting to rely on me to just kind of work my magic. You'll just see 4 different graphics overlaid in very roughly here. Take a look.
Hey, Detroit, do you even mocha? Of course you do. You know all about planer trackers and garbage mats, don't you? VFX is taking over, and we want you to join us, because for us, VFX ain't a fad, it's a way of life.
So what you can correctly gather from that is that we're going to be branding this set of cuts from the city of Detroit to reflect our brand, VFX. This time around, I'm going to try something a little bit different and actually show you my final before I show you how to make it.
Hey, Detroit, do you even mocha? Of course you do. You know all about planer trackers and garbage mats, don't you? VFX is taking over, and we want you to join us, because for us, VFX ain't a fad, it's a way of life.
Now, however many elements and shots with elements you counted there, I bet you missed a few. So here now is a walk through everything that I did, and we're going to go kind of group these together in a way that makes sense, and by the end of it, you're going to know practically everything there is to know about planar tracking in Mocha. So a sign replacement like this is one of the easiest and often most satisfying things you can do with Mocha. You can troll famous people by replacing whatever they're holding up, or in this case, we can give the sign a different meaning. Now, of course, we could replace the sign altogether, but I thought it would be fun to say no stopping VFX, right? Get it? Okay, so here's how we're going to do it. I already have Mocha applied, and I'll just open it, and I'm going to make a selection around that word anytime that I am replacing. And it's hard to keep in mind that it doesn't matter whether I tidally line up my selection with the word anytime or not. I'm going to go ahead and turn on perspective. I inadvertently started at a keyframe in the middle, so I'm going to have to do this backward and then go back to the keyframe and forward. And that does not really matter. Let's play the result. There's something that you can do to see how good your track is, and that is to swap in something that would replace that word anytime. And for that, I'm first going to enable the planar surface. This is what we would be replacing in. And I'll just give myself plenty of room around that word anytime. And because I'm kind of OCD, I'm going to try to actually make the lines parallel. And then under layer properties, let's insert a logo and play that. Wow, okay, looking good. Now, I could use these corners that I set for a corner pin, but I'm not going to do that. I will tell you why when we're back in the comp. Right now, what I want to do now, I want to go to the first frame, and if I did this in another frame, it's no problem, I could change it, but when I save, I want at the first frame to have clicked on this button, expand the planar surface to fill the entire frame. So it's not so easy to see, but now there's a blue frame around the entire clip. So it is 1920 by 1080. If I play that, you can see it's going out of bounds and so on, but you can see it's exactly following apparently the whole shot, but definitely what I tracked. And by the way, part of the reason to select the word anytime, if that's what I'm replacing, is that that becomes sort of like my anchor point, depending on how I set it up. So let's now get out of here, being careful to save. Oh, and I didn't give it a name. Let's just be a little tidy. So we'll just call this anytime. Now, if I twirl down tracking data, my first step is going to be to create track data. And I do have to select the layer by clicking on the cog. And then you see those numbers changed over there. If I go back to the first frame, everything is zeroed out to the defaults because I framed the shot, remember, at the 0 frame. And that just made it a little easier. If I use the Uber key here, you can see there's no data. This data is not going to be applied directly. I have to apply it. So if, for example, I wanted to do multiple tracks off of one instance of Mocha, I can keep recreating new track data and then applying it. If that doesn't make sense here, let me apply the data and then you'll see what I mean. We need a target. I'm going to make a solid and I will call it patch, and I'll just make it the size of the comp. Let me turn it off for a moment. Had I used a corner pin just around any time, I would be filling this small patch area with that entire solid. And if you notice, there's a bunch of irregularities and stuff in here that I have to match, and I would have to do that at scale or stick it in a pre-comp to touch it up. And I don't want to do any of that stuff. So what I'm going to do right here at the 0 frame is just make myself a selection area around any time. I can make it a little bit loose so that I can feather this out and so on. And then I'm just going to double click and rotate it into place. Kind of, I don't have to line it up precisely, but so there's a patch. It's not matching exactly yet, but it's a start. At the bottom here of the tracking data controls, I have to choose how I'm exporting the track that I made. Any of these three could be viable here. In this case, I'm going to go with just corner pin. Support motion blur is often useful, but it adds position data in order to create motion blur, and that's going to reposition my object, and I don't see any motion blur in this shot, so I'm not going to worry about that. Apply to patch and say apply export, and there are keyframes. If you want to see them, specifically they're corner pin keyframes. So the corner pin effect has been applied and it's animated, and we can preview it. And that is sticking like glue. Now, just to show the same process can be used on multiple layers, let's add our text at this point. Now, I did preset this. I already selected the correct font and weight and size. And it just so happens, I think I nailed it. I actually think this is the font that this actual sign used. So again, I can get this kind of where I want it to be at frame 0. Click W for the rotate tool and just rotate that into place. Actually, the patch is faking me out, so let me get right in there and line this up. All right, that looks pretty good. I think we might need to blur this just a tinch, and it's probably going to need, I don't know if it needs grain or not because it's so bright, but let's at least blur it out a little bit. And I think just a very slight Gaussian blur, 2 pixels, and that'll do that. I can turn the patch back on, and I just need to line it up. A quick way to take care of this right here, and it works amazingly well in a lot of cases like this. Hard surface, varying lighting and surface conditions. First of all, obviously we need to feather this mask a little bit. That's already quite a bit better, and some people would just go ahead and want to get away with that, but we are going to do better than that, my friend. So we're going to go with a 4-color gradient. This is under the generate category. And if I zoom out, by default, those targets are way out in the corners here. So I'm just going to move each one in. I'm really only showing you this so you know kind of how it works. I don't need to see all my perfect. We could go ahead and just select some of these edge colors. And if you want to do even a little better, you can pick any one of them and go, well, maybe we brighten that one up a little more. And maybe this one we darken it down just a skosh. So from here, we've just got a little housekeeping to do. We need the text to come along for the ride. I'll copy the corner pin and paste it. I could also reapply it from Mocha, or I could even set a corner pin and go into each channel and link expressions between them. I'm not planning to change this. This is good to go. So now let's add some grain. And I'm going to say that this grain only needs to be applied to that patch, not to the text. What I do see in the text is this kind of shadow, which is actually the result of JPEG compression. Now, if I were being really exacting about this, I would go ahead and match that, maybe with a shadow layer style, but I'm just can't be bothered right now. So let's instead do what's important, which is this grain. The white outline is the default preview setting. Let's change that to final and choose my plate layer to match. I didn't see an instant difference. So what I'm going to do is go under tweaking and just turn up the intensity until I can really see it. Oh yeah, there we go. I do think it needs a boost in intensity because of all this grain that I see out here. So I'm also looking along the top. I'm going to go somewhere in the middle. I'm going to talk really quick about something very important to both motion graphics artists and visual effects artists, which is effect order. My grain is working great. I'm going to solo my little patch. But remember, the patch is masked from a full frame. And for match grain to work, it wants to work on the full frame. Otherwise, it's scaled down and it's looking weird. Sometimes things like corner pin that change your dimensions and 4-color gradient, which are overwriting things, will mess with it. So for example, if I move up 1 in the stack, it goes away, obviously because I just overwrote it with match grain. Had I done a corner pin down to this size from a full frame, I'd also have a problem because the grain would be scaled down. In this case, remember, I'm actually tracking the full frame. So if I disable the mask for a second, what we've actually got here is this big, huge frame moving, and that's what match grain wants. It wants to aim at a target that's the same size as the source footage. Now, you and I know there's the edge of a box right there, but nobody else is going to know that. It's amazing how often something relatively unsophisticated actually works incredibly well. 4-corner gradient doesn't seem like a very useful effect, and yet the way light hits surfaces, it's often exactly the right thing for a patch like what I did here. And then in terms of Mocha, throughout this lesson, we're going to be pre-comping to get our elements positioned. And right now, we're doing that by setting up the full frame. And we're going to do that again in the next one, just to really drive that home. So in that last exercise, you saw me apply a corner pin, but it was the size of the full frame. In Mocha, what often happens when you create a track is you get a track area that's somewhere within that track region, or you could specify it. And I could even say, yeah, I want the dropper to be right in this corner pin area. So what happens if I decide that my corner pin should be within this area? My graphics should just fit right into that, right? Well, let's take a look. So I'll apply it. I have the eyedropper layer selected here. It's scaled down, by the way, to 9%. So if I were to reset the scaling on that, it's huge. And that still shouldn't prevent it from working, right? So let's just apply it. And it's there, but it's teeny. If I highlight the corner pin effect, you can see that it's been corner pinned into an area just inside that region that I had. So here's what's happening. Mocha is assuming that the corners that I specified are the corners of this comp. And it's also assuming that my layer is the size of this comp. So what it's done is proportionally corner pin it into what it perceives to be where I put this thing. And it just feels totally wrong, right? Well, you could work around this, and the workaround would be to pre-comp the full size layer. But actually what I would do, I'm going to go Command Option F and make it the exact size of the frame. And now that would fit properly into that corner pin frame that I made. But that's kind of a pain. So for that reason, I'm going to go back to Mocha so I can change it on the fly, remember. As you can see, I use perspective again. It's a really good looking track. So now I'll just click this button, and I meant to do that at the first frame, of course. So let's do it again. Boom. Now it's been set to the edges of the frame. And so that reverses the problem we had with corner pinning to an area inside the frame, if that makes sense. And I'll just say save. Now, having done that, you'd think my problems are solved. So I create track data with corner and update it, and then I apply it, and it's still miniature, not as much as before. And scaling it up is not the answer. So instead, there's one more step that I just want to make sure you're doing if you take this approach. So either way, we're pre-comping, but in this case, we get a little more flexibility. Let me go to the first frame and just position this thing where I want it, and then I'll create a pre-comp. Now, when you create the pre-comp, make sure that you choose move all attributes into the new composition, because we want the new comp to be the size of the frame. You can even open it just so we see it, and there it is in place. And now, if I apply the export to that, I press play, and it's good to go. Now, let's suppose, for comping this, I want some of these scratches on the sign to show through this thing, so it doesn't look quite so pristine. I could try a blending mode on it, but one thing when I was experimenting with this was to put a hard light on the background. Now, that doesn't do anything if the eyedropper is sitting on top of it, but if I move it down to the bottom, now the sign is hard lit over that eyedropper, and it's got the scratches just subtly coming through there. That's really all I wanted, subtlety. So a lot of people don't know this thing about being able to set the corner pin to the full frame and then just position things in a pre-comp where you want them. And if you move them in the pre-comp. That's kind of a pain. But what's not a pain is you don't have to deal with this thing of things scaling in ways you don't expect. There are, however, plenty of cases where you actually want a corner pin, either literally fill the frame of something, the four corners, or just kind of say, well, I want it to line up with this surface that has kind of this rectilinear appearance. And throughout this lesson, we're going to have quite a few of those. So more generally, though, I would keep in mind the flexibility of this thing of just using the full frame. In either case, you pretty much usually have to pre-comp. Next, we move to this beautiful shot, and it just really seems tailor-made for Mocha. It's just a big wall that's so beautifully shot and just changing its perspective, and you can just already tell how well this is going to track, right? There are a couple of things to watch out for with a shot like this. One that we don't have to worry about here is lens distortion. So if I were trying to fill these exactly, and I think this will come up in another shot, so I'm not going to actually show you here, you might find that there's a little bit of distortion that is making what looks like a straight edge here a little bit curved. So that's one thing to be concerned with. And the rest of what there's to be concerned of, we're going to handle right in the shot. So let me just open that up. And I'll take these layers. So I have my elements already in here. Other than the fact that I used a couple of blending modes to get this logo looking kind of how I want it to look over the concrete. So I've actually gone ahead and pre-done this. Now, this is kind of like the hard light trick that I showed in the last one. So this isn't necessarily how anyone would do this, but I start with the logo, and the color pass, the color blending mode, is just giving me the color from the logo. So there's very little color in the black parts. And then this other darken layer is, of course, taking care of the dark elements. And having those independent of one another gives me control over how much I want the color itself to pop versus the contrast. And so all I did was adjust the opacity in the darken layer. And so if I crank that up, I would have control over that. And then in this other layer, a tint effect at its default turns the color black and white. So now I have control over how vivid and saturated the color is. So it was just looking a little too strong without some of that, and I arrived at the perfect setting of 42. Now, of course, I could pre-comp these, but then I'd be keeping track of blending modes through a pre-comp, so I'm just going to leave them as separate layers. Now on to Mocha. I'm going to go ahead and set up this track, and you get to watch it at high speed because I'm going to be doing it for 4 separate elements. Now, inadvertently, I made my keyframe in the middle. Doesn't really matter. Just I have to click this button twice. We'll go forward, and then we'll go backward. And we have an error, and there's something I did wrong. So in fact, I need to redo these tracks. But let me explain about this error first. So layer 4 has left the frame, and that seems like a problem. But in fact, the area where I want to add my element is already off frame. So Mocha did this perfectly well. It gave me a couple scary warnings, and it stopped the whole track. But in the grand scheme of things, that doesn't matter. I got the track that I want. However, because I didn't turn on perspective for these, which was a careless error on my part, I'm just going to retrack them with that on for each of them. I don't think you can do this with multi-selection. And let's get it right this time. Forward. All the cogs are enabled, so it's tracking all 4 of them again. So there's that error again. Let's say OK to that. Turn off tracking for this one layer. And let's keep going. And this layer also is leaving frame, but we got to the beginning without having to worry about it. And you can see that the shape really fully kept its integrity. So this is pretty amazing. Like, Mocha is actually able to understand that it's not looking for information in areas that have gone off frame, and most trackers just aren't that smart. So having done that, I have a red area over here, but that's just corresponding to layer 4. I'm done tracking, and I'm just going to turn those cogs off. I could give some friendly colors here. Let's go ahead. I'm going to be making planar surfaces for each of these shapes in the shape of the element that I want. So on the right, I have my logo, which is not square, and then the other elements, which are. So notice I do not want to be moving my track shapes, which I accidentally did. I'll just get rid of that keyframe. Just moving the planar surface area, and now I have that for all 4 layers. This one I wanted to be inset a bit, and whatever adjustment I make applies to all the frames. So we are good. And now it's just a question of applying those. Now, when I thought about this particular section of the lesson, I considered whether I should really do these in a single Mocha effect since they're applying to a bunch of different layers. Here's the issue. Under tracking data, I say create track data, and I have to choose one of the layers. I can only choose one. If I choose a different one, that one is disabled. So let's just start with layer 1. I switch this to a corner pin that supports motion blur, and I apply it first to layer 5. And then I just switch it here to layer 4. I'm not going to get tricky and try to chain them together or anything. They're just going to each get their own data because I'm not really going to need to manipulate it. If I just even drag through the timeline, that baby is stuck. And the way that I comp them is allowing that chalk drawing to look like it's been drawn on top of the graffiti. In this case, the logo's not as vivid as most clients would want it. They'd probably want it to look completely opaque, like it was just painted on there. I think it's really cool to draw people in and have it look like the chalk is over the logo, even though it's not that way, because blending modes, you can use them backwards. We've already done it a couple times. I just like creating a little bit of intrigue and a little more realism that way. And that's kind of my general style. So blending modes suit me really well, actually. The eyedropper is already filled with a color that's going to kind of blend into the wall. And actually, We don't even need the blur on there. I'm leaving in some things that I had already done. We'll just reapply the blur once we add our corner pin. Now here is where my dilemma came into play. So when I say create track data, I'm now going to layer 2 because I'm going to the next panel. And that's a new set of keyframes. Well, it's okay really, because there's no reason I need to hold the old keyframes anymore. I'm actually done with them. So I can just move on. I mean, I guess maybe there's a case where you wouldn't want to do it this way, but I don't even know what that would be. So now I'm just applying track number 2 to layer 3, and there it is. And there again is a case where the position isn't exactly what I wanted. And so why transform is under distort, I don't know, although I guess technically you are distorting the shot by transforming it. Remember to move this above corner pin. And then either anchor point, or I'm just going to go ahead with position because anchor point doesn't really matter to me here. They work interchangeably, of course. I'll go with something like that. Next layer, same thing again. This time we're creating track data for layer 3. I know they don't correspond. And so now I choose layer 2 and apply that. Let's take a look. So again, why these need to be slid over, I could look into it, but I'm just gonna not fight that. Maybe you're more expert than I am, either now or later after you work with this for a bit, and you know exactly what happened. But since there's a simple fix, and since I probably would want to finesse the positions anyway, I am good. And then here is our tracking marker that's going to pass right out of frame. That is our 4th track. Going to layer 1. And there it goes. And once again, I'd like to just scooch it over. Now when you do these fixes, like transforming to scooch it over, just make sure, and I think I want to scale this down a little bit too. So zoom right in and just make sure that track's not slipping. So look at the edge against, say, that A and chalk. Because if I were to take the whole layer with the corner pin and move the whole layer over, i.e. move the corner pin data over, it would now effectively have moved off the wall. And so it would look like it was floating in front of the wall, like it would parallax with it by moving the whole layer. That is not what's happening because I'm moving these behind the corner pin, as you saw. They do need a bit of that blur, so let's just put in a blur. I'm going to go ahead with a fast box blur for all these. Let's go. At 3, it's the same as a Gaussian blur. At 2, it's a bit cruder than a Gaussian blur, and I kind of like that. We don't need much, even 1 on that layer is good. I'm going to copy that, and the next layer is going to be a bit blurrier. So we can have a blur radius of more like 2 on this one, or even 1.5. Yeah, that's plenty. And then this guy is going to probably get 2. Good. And we could talk about grain. These are translucent, so they are picking up the grain of the background. So my inclination is not to try to add grain until such time as something stands out and these look wrong. But even if I do my raising exposure to look at grain, I'm not seeing a mismatch. And there you have it. Unless you're directly applying Mocha to your layer by, say, applying the matte from Mocha, and usually instead we're actually creating a mask and doing it that way, you could theoretically delete it, or you could make a placeholder layer to just hold on to the effect. So your Mocha project is saved in Mocha, which the instance of which is in the effect of that layer. You can copy it and you get all those same controls to another layer, or you can just store it away on a layer that you don't even use. From a Mocha tracking perspective, this has to be the easiest shot in the entire sequence. But there's a gotcha in here, and rather than go down the road of getting trapped by it and then solving it, I'm giving you a heads up about it now. You may run into this. So I didn't notice that in the edit there were some retimes, and in this pre-comp, the plate came through with a stretch value of 62.5. Guess what? Mismatched frame values with anything to do with tracking is a disaster. And there are ways to solve it, but basically what you get are keyframes that, while correct, are not lined up, and then you either have to scale them down, or things just get really haywire in a way that's not even logical. Luckily, there's a simple solution. I'm just going to take this value and replace it with 100 after cutting it, and I'll have to change this pre-comp a little bit. Back in the main cut, actually let's change the pre-comp first. So I'm going to make it longer than it needs to be, like way longer. Okay, and then that's the actual duration. So Command Option B sets the work area there, then right clicking here lets me trim the comp to that work area. And with the subcomps I have, remember these are just holding stills. So with these, I'm going to go ahead and say time freeze frame, and then their length is kind of arbitrary. So that's not going to be a problem. So then having lengthen the comp, I'll go back here and set that value of 62.5% right there, and everything is back as it was, but I'm just going to be tracking whole frames in real time meaning frame by frame time. Time is arbitrary. Whoa, okay, I'm getting really cosmic now. After Effects cares about seconds, and that's actually a really useful thing. Let me talk about that for a second. So just as a reminder, I brought this up in a week, and I'm just going to bring it up again. You have to be extra vigilant about time in After Effects when you're working with footage. So you can change timing, but if you change timing when you've applied an effect like Mocha, that's very time dependent, things are going to break. And so if you run into a situation where you think you might need to change the timing of a clip, just keep it in mind. So I see that while I was talking to you just now, some gnomes helpfully went in and tracked this shot in Mocha. It's dead easy, so just reviewing it is probably good enough. We've got nice large tracking areas, and we have the target square region on the right and a rectangular one on the left to fit the artwork that we have, which is a pen for the right and this logo for the left. So the art of this one is not going to be in the tracking, but in the comping. Let's get to it. I will create data for the left side first, and I will choose that logo. I've applied it. There are the keyframes. I'll turn it on, and that is tracking beautifully as expected. So I've gone ahead and gotten both of my elements in here. And then additionally, I set a darken mode on this logo on the right. So I just want it to have this appearance that it is on the wheat paste. And therefore I want it off the bricks. So for that, I took 2 more instances of my plate layer, and I'm going to use that as a Luma mat. So Luma, could have selected both layers and done it at once, but that is the beginning. And then the way I'm going to dial this in is with the levels effect, because the histogram is going to be helpful. So by coming up on the input black and crushing the blacks in that mat, I can make it disappear on the bricks. Now, one thing I could do, I'll show just this layer. Let's take a look at the color channels. So there's not very good contrast in red, but green and blue have great contrast. Blue tends to be the noisier channel. So what I'm going to do is shift channels and set everything to green, and then add a levels effect to that. It's an extra step, but I think it's going to make things go more smoothly. So let's just see if I'm right. So now, I don't have to go as hard to get the black off the bricks, which was my main goal there. And then if I want to adjust the look of it to be darker or more faded, I've got room to do that. I can also just kind of bracket this in. So that's the last of the whites, so just bringing this in brings that gamma naturally down. That's a good starting point. I'll copy both of those and see if those work for the pen as well. Yeah, that's pretty good. So let's preview the shot and see how that looks. Now something odd is happening here, and it's actually something that probably you didn't notice, I didn't notice about the shot, which is the change of light. I think a cloud is passing over the sun as the shot goes on. The shadows get darker, but I didn't really notice that before. But it's also causing our white bricks to get darker, and therefore the levels to change. So we just need to kind of shift this over. Now the histogram is again going to help with this. The reason we don't use auto exposure to shoot professional footage almost ever is that it changes as the conditions in the scene change. So if somebody walks across frame and they're prominent in the frame, they're going to change the lighting levels just by their presence in that frame as the camera adjusts for that. In this case, we've got a clip where a cloud came across, and it's kind of unusual in shots that aren't, say, time-lapse, to have something like that happen. And it's an opportunity, actually, once you've spotted it, because it's not really that hard to deal with. It can even be a lot of fun. Some of the real hero shots I pulled off had changing lighting conditions, and it's very satisfying to nail them. So I'm not going to get tricky about this. I'll just start at the very beginning and set a keyframe for both of these and expose it for each. And then I'll take a snapshot of that, go to the end. And actually I kind of like this faded look, so maybe I'll match this one and take this backward. So I just need keyframes set there at the end. And so that's actually the one I'll snapshot. And then over here, let's see what I can do to kind of match that. So that's the look. And I think I'm going to get there by messing with the gamma. So for the pen, that looks good. And then do the same here, and let's preview that. Awesome. This is very similar. The only difference is going to be in the compositing. So I've skipped ahead a little bit. I've already got my track I'll show you. Very straightforward. All I really had to think about on this one was avoiding this telephone pole that's creating parallax. Now, I did mention to the client that this is kind of breaking the kind of rules that we've set in the rest of the spot, because I don't think graffiti on the scale of 10 stories of the abandoned Detroit train station is quite possible, but hey, it's movie magic. So I have my keyframes here. This was another case where I did have a retime layer, and so I had to again go back and just get everything starting from 0 and stretch to 100%, and then I will just apply that, and there is, and done. Looks great. Oh, fine, okay. So some of the drill, you know. The transform behind the corner pin is the easiest way to finagle the thing into the exact position you want. And then I'm thinking the white part is going to be dark and go over the background. So the way to achieve that, I'm going to go with an extract effect and just take out the black that way. We can add a little threshold, but not much. And then add a fill and use kind of something dark like that. Okay, now it's done, right? No? Okay, well, I think what needs to happen is that this needs to be a matte on the layer. And I always just delete extraneous effects that aren't needed. And this is going to be, once again, a Luma matte. And that's kind of interesting. And once again, I'm going to use the levels effect to firm that up. So let's see, let me get my bearings here. Yeah, something like that. And then I was playing around with this and I decided sometimes something super cheap works great. So what I'm going to do is take this matte and offset it some. Let me find the sweet spot. Something like that. I want it to just give a little bit of dimension. Let's see what that does. Yeah, that's the basic idea. It doesn't have to be quite that dark, so I could ease up in here. Although maybe dark is good, I don't know. Somewhere in the middle. Split the diff. Let's look at it in real time with the color correction. Ooh, that looks pretty cool. And that lens flare is even kind of still working, huh? Beautiful. 3D artists in particular, and all of us, need to keep in mind that 3D is not always the solution just because something dimensional is happening in a scene. You need to keep in mind things where it's actually possible to fake it. And there are a lot of cases that come up where basically you can do that. And there are even cases where it would be very complicated to do something in 3D and extremely simple to do it in 2D. And those are the ones I want you to watch out for. This opening shot has literally nothing that we haven't covered elsewhere, with two exceptions. One, there is a time remap on this one, so even more than the ones where we had a different frame rate. Got to really tread carefully here, but everything is working out fine. And we can take a look at the Mocha track. It's very straightforward. You may not have even seen all three of the elements in this shot. 1, 2, 3, or 1, 2, 3 is actually how I numbered them. And so 1 is this marker on the roof, and it started out like that. So it's just got a little gentle color matching in there. And then 2 and 3, a little harder to see. Started like that, inverted, got a levels to match it in, a box blur to get it at the right distance, and then a match grain. Now, this layer, I noticed when I was reviewing it just now that the match grain seems to have gone completely haywire. And if I just UU to just see what's been adjusted in it, the only thing that's been adjusted is final output. So all I did, and that would actually be my problem. So I don't have it set to a source layer. So it is effectively broken. So let's reset it to the background. Match grain's a pretty cool tool. I, on the other hand, often use the add grain effect and just go ahead and dial it in by my own eye, flashing the exposure up and down to make sure I can really see the grain, whether it's in the shadows or highlights or what have you. Either way, I think it's worth taking that close look and making sure it's correct. Match grain is a little slower, in my opinion, and if it doesn't get a good reference, it may not give you the result you want at all. And with add grain, usually by changing the size, the softness, and the intensity, those three things, you can get to a good enough match. So now the real fun begins. We're going to take this logo and place it into this scene. Whoa. And the obvious place to put it is on this nice frame over here. Genius. So here's what I discovered working with this in Mocha. We all tend sometimes to take kind of the on-the-nose, obvious approach. And in this case, that would be to draw a boundary around this frame right here. And I could even select all the points and just tighten them up like that. But of course, it doesn't matter to Mocha whether I'm perfectly along the edges of this shape or not. So what am I doing? Well, let's just keep moving forward. And I'm right here in the middle. So we know what's going to happen, right? When the pole crosses in front of this area, it's going to be a problem. So let's just get it over with and see what happens. I'm going to not track perspective. I think there's a little perspective in this. Yeah. So luckily we know there's a fix for that. And so this is going to be my frame. And then I'm going to add a track for that pole. Now, my tracking area for the pole is going to have to be within the boundaries of that motion blur. Because if I go outside, things are going to be changing a lot. So the static part of the pole is something like that. So now I'll just track that pole. That looked good. Go the other way. Awesome. And in case it wasn't clear before, simply by having that layer above my frame layer, I get the benefit of it being a holdout. So let's see what happens. Still not happy. Well, I think the problem is that there's still a lot that's coming through the frame here. So I'm going to turn off the pole, but I'm going to draw a new object specifically just to block the frame. I'm going to make it much wider. This would never track, but I don't need it to. I'll turn off tracking for that, and under layer properties, I'll just link it to pole and name it blocker. And there it goes. It's going to help hold out this area over the frame. So let's see how that works. Still not much of an improvement. What to do? Now, you could keep fighting this. It's doing its best. But I'm going to close this. I'll save it, of course, because that pole track is great. I'm going to use that. I'm going to call this one Mocha Pole. And it doesn't matter if it's on or off, because remember, Mocha doesn't do anything directly to the clip it's on. But I'll just turn it off anyway to remind me, and apply it again. And this one will be Mocha Frame, because we're going to nail it this time. So what I realized is that once you get a little more nonlinear with your thinking, you can pick up on the fact that you don't need to track this whole frame. In fact, a small but distinct portion of it may be adequate. So let me just show you what I mean. There's a lot of detail in the shape I just drew. And I'm just prettying it up for my own sake, but really, that's what I had in mind. So as soon as I start tracking backwards, there's going to be a problem. But tracking forwards works beautifully. All I have to do, I could go there, or even one frame further. Let's try this one. I'm just going to move this into place. Let's see if I got it. And that tracks perfectly as well. And then, through the magic of computing, and the fact that we're moving at a steady state, boom, I get free in between frames. Wow. So you see basic principles of computer animation apply here. Okay, so having done that, I do now need to be precise about where we're corner pinning to. I'm just going to say it's this frame. Maybe that's too literal, but it'll be a starting point. And there's another benefit to being real precise with these points that's going to come up, maybe in the shot or maybe in one that follows. Let's just preview that. What? So, something has gone wrong. And rather than assume I need to fix it, it's worth looking also at, do I even need it? As an aside, one question worth asking here is, do I even need to track this in? The motion appears to be completely linear. So as a test, I animated in the logo instead, just using a couple of keyframes. Well, that's odd. It looks like it's bobbing up and down. But if I solo it, it's not doing that at all. So in fact, nature, as usual, is quite deceptive. No, 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 no. I am not hand tracking an element for a tracking class. You know how to do that. Now back to this track gone awry, and never fear, there are a couple of fantastic learning opportunities right here. First of all, when things go haywire with the corners like that, and everything seems sane everywhere else, the first thing to suspect is perspective. And turning that off, because I realized there really is no perspective shift happening to that little bit of graffiti there, I realized there's also no skew, rotation, or scale going on with that. So I'll turn all of them off, because why the heck not? It'll at least show that we can do that and get away with it. And we're going to retrack in both directions from each of our points once again. So that has calmed down the blue frame. And now the issue is just that it is not in-betweening in here. Well, this gives me the opportunity to show a way that you can actually fine-tune this thing, or in this case, it's going to be a coarse adjustment, but we're going to still fine-tune it anyway. Let me show you what I mean. So for this, I'm going to go to Classic View, and we're going to look under a tab we haven't checked out yet, which is Adjust Track over here. Now I know this is where the UI gets scary, and there's a lot of stuff in here. We looked at the dope sheets before, but we're just kind of taking things on as we need them. So Adjust Track. Going to this tab presents these 4 red kind of box cursors with X's in the middle. To keep this less confusing, I'm going to actually turn off the surface, because these are not quite the same thing as that. I'm just going to adjust these, and here's what I want to do. I'm looking for an actual pixel detail that I can guarantee will match from frame to frame. So something really distinctive, like the end of that line right in the center, kind of like that. This one I would also put right at the end of the line. I don't need to worry about lining them up with one another. I just need something that I can look at later and go, yep, that point. This one I'm going to go right by the thick part of that. And this one, same idea. Okay, let's try that. Having done that, I'm going to say, or rather not say, well I am going to say, but I'm also going to click on Set Master All. Okay, nothing miraculous has happened yet, or has it? Nope. So let's go back to my other frame. Now, I can press Auto, and if these were close to their targets, Mocha might go ahead and find them, but they're not at all close. So we're going to place them where they belong. Now look at this little bit of UI up here. Top and bottom. The top is showing me my reference from the other keyframe. And then down below, in real time, I'm getting a close-up view of my attempt to match it. This makes it pretty darn easy, even though this seems like total brute force work. It's kind of an elegant way to just get in and fix something. And it's especially useful, as I say, for much finer adjustments, like if we were trying to truly closely match the corners of this frame here, which we are, but really our graffiti just has to look like it's not wobbling around. It's not going to be framed perfectly in here. Having done that, let's see what happened. Okay, well the red points seem to be now moving right along with the corners of the frame, and if I go to my surface, it is now also playing along. Now it doesn't look quite right, although again, because my logo is not, my graffiti rather, is not rectangular. Nobody's going to know. But just to show you, I can still go in and adjust the planar surface. It would help actually if I go out of adjust track mode to do that so that I'm not competing between the two. And let's call that good and see. Let's go back to Essentials View just to show that this will work perfectly well there. / will reframe around the shot. I'm going to zoom out a little bit more than that. And let's play this. Bada bing, bada boom. Now, it might feel like we're digging down into this very arcane and kludgy little area of Mocha and fixing things that it should just be doing. But actually, the interface that we're looking at, Adjust Track, is really actually essential to precision corner pinning with Mocha. It is the way to get the points exactly on, and it works surprisingly well, much better than, say, corner pinning with the After Effects point tracker tool and then trying to fix those by moving those points into place. Even though it feels like we're kind of digging down into the guts here, in situations where we're trying to get a precise corner pin track, these would be very common to be adjusting. So now, ladies and gentlemen, the hard work of tracking is complete, and it is up to us to composite and fool our viewer into believing that this graffiti logo was actually part of the scene when it was shot. So to start, let's track in the logo. Using my Mocha frame track, I'm going to create some track data for frame. This is going to be a corner pin. There is definitely motion blur, and that's going to go to the logo. Let's turn on that logo. Motion blur is already turned on, both for the comp and on the layer. And let's see what we got. Interesting. So something looks like it's amiss, but what we know is amiss is that the pole is going behind the logo. Whether the logo is tracking properly or not, we don't really yet know. Our eye is being fooled right now. So to move forward, I'm going to rename this layer background and take care of the pole. I can duplicate, Command Shift right square bracket to take it to the top, even though it was only one layer up. This will be named pole. And to really do my house cleaning, I'm going to take the second Mocha effect off this one and the Mocha pole effect off the background. So they've each got the one that corresponds to them. Now, out of habit, in this lesson, I almost want to go under tracking data, but in fact, we are interested in matte data for this pole. And all we're going to do is create a mask and turn on motion blur, that is. So the mask is created. Let's just take a look. But I left the wrong frames on, so let's undo that. Go into Mocha and turn off everything but visibility for pole. And try again. Okay, that's going to be better. Now, without motion blur on, you can see that it is tracked in there, but we're missing all this goodness. So let's just enable it. Oh, and something strange happened. Well, this is a huge aha moment, and this harkens back to the very first lesson in the course where we talked about motion blur and how cameras work. So let's now take a peek in comp settings and fix this problem. So the 180 shutter is a filmic motion blur. That is half of the 360. It's the little half circle that turns around and around 48 times per second for a 24 frame per second film. That's a mechanical camera. And yeah, the electronic cameras can do a whole bunch of other stuff, but this remains kind of the gold standard for motion blur. Filmic motion blur is a 180 shutter angle, as we've already discussed. So the problem here, and the telltale sign being the shift to the right, is the shutter phase. Now, we don't have to guess at this setting. It's always going to be the same relative to the angle. Why After Effects doesn't just automatically make it the same relative to the angle, I don't know. but it gives me something to teach you. So what you do is divide the angle in half, whatever the number is, take half of that, and then make it the negative. So 180 divided by 2, 90, and then negative 90 is the value that's going to go in here. And that fixed the offset problem. Let's just take a look. So it's no longer shifting, but it looks weird. Well, I think the weird look actually is because this element right now is so bright, it's punching right through all the motion blur. So by comping this element properly, I think we're going to take care of that. Let's find out. So to work, I'm just going to turn off the pole for a second and even go to a frame where I can just see this clearly. So let's see. I think, first of all, we don't need this thing to be so kind of squarely in the frame like that. I know the preference from the client was to have things look a little bit more wild. So let's go with changing the rotation. And you know what? I don't need these rotation keyframes. We could take a peek. They're just not changing much. I know that looks like a big change, but notice the values are in the 0.2 or less area. So there's effectively no rotation happening here. And if that was hard to follow, just take my word for it. We can delete the rotation keyframes and go ahead and freely rotate this as we wish. Same with scale. It's not scaling over time either. And position we do care about, but to move it up, I can just select all these frames. And if I move it by just scooching the value up and down, left and right, as long as all those keyframes stayed selected while I did that, everything is still good. Animators, you know this, but keyframes are not sacred. You're free to delete them. The ones that don't work, see if you can live without them. Less is more, etc., etc. Well, the first and most obvious problem that we've already come up against is that this thing is just too bright and saturated. There are multiple ways to desaturate an image. The fastest is just to apply a tint and then bring down the amount. Let's leave it the defaults, and it goes from black and white down to somewhere in there. Is looking pretty good as a starting point. I don't want to take too much color out yet. We can desaturate it more as needed, but I do want it to pop a little bit. So for now, let's go with that. The next thing to comp it in is to not have it be kind of floating over the wall. There's clear seams and things that should be showing through. And so for that, I'll duplicate the plate background and rename this one Overlay. I'm going to use a blending mode, which is not going to be overlay mode, but that's okay. And housekeeping, I'll just get rid of the mocha and that, and then change the blending mode to, ready for it, darken. And now we just see some lines appear. It's also dulled down the graffiti quite a bit. We can adjust for that. With the darken mode, I'm going to use levels once again so we can look at the histogram. And you can see all the highlights appear that if I start to knock these out, the areas that are getting darkened by the highest highlights are going to pop back through. And that's looking really good to me. So the amount of tint that I had on there is kind of back in play. I could go somewhere a little bit in the middle, but I kind of like it. I'm just curious what happens. So the gamma is going to start to affect the image. By coming in just on the top, I'm not affecting the image much. Yeah, adjusting the gamma will. So this is a trick that's done best with a light touch. There are other ways, of course, to achieve that, but that was a very simple way to do it, and I just wanted a little bit of a suggestion of the texture there. Having done that, let's take another look at the motion blur. Well, I have an effect order problem, don't I? Because poll is turned off. And sure enough, just as I thought, there's no longer a problem with the logo punching through the motion blur. There does seem to be some other problem though. What is that? Oh, I see. It's just a little thing on the poll. All right. No big deal. I think we're okay. Let's preview the shot. Now I know it's going to sound ridiculous, but I would also add a little bit of grain to that element. And I'm going to keep using match grain, even though I always check it and make sure it's what I actually want. So each time I set it to final output, I'll set it to the background. But now I'm going to zoom in here and do my usual trick of raising exposure till I can see the grain. There's not a lot of grain in here. Sometimes grain can be hard to see in a shot like this because nothing is staying still. So maybe that was an unnecessary call. So let's see what else could I have been seeing that might need attention. I guess really it's actually back to basics. I can leave the grain on there, it's fine. Doesn't really harm anything to have it there. But I'm going to readjust the tint just a little bit to give it more of the kind of drab look of the shot. And I think that is going to do it. So for a little more satisfaction, we can look at it with the color correction. Nice. Now, in the case of this shot, things are kind of blown out, and when they're really bright like that and kind of blurry, you're not going to get much grain from the sensor. You'd only get compression grain, and it's probably not that essential in this case. If I haven't said it before, I feel that grain is often your friend. It can actually hide things that you don't want people to see so clearly, but it also can give everything this kind of alive quality that, okay, I'm old school, but I kind of like it. Starting with this shot and adding this element to it would seem rather similar to the one we just did. But we're going to take a completely different approach. Now, one thing about Mocha is anytime something passes in front of another thing, I know that that is going to be a thing I'm going to have to deal with. And I just wonder, is it really necessary here? Just as in the last one, we're really only talking about a transform here. And I wonder if I could just point track this. So let's give it a try. Before we do that, let's kind of establish the look we're going for here. So to get my logo to look like it belongs on that chimney, obviously I need to scale it down a bit. I could do it interactively right in here as well. And it looks really flat. Yeah? So I think I'd like to sit it somewhere up there. And then how am I going to make it not look flat? How about we look for a perspective effect? CC cylinder sounds like it might do the trick. Sorry, that was a bit much of a wind up there. And now the scale's going to have to come back up. And obviously that's not quite right, but we will fix. So let's unwrap this. So right now it's doing a full 360 around the chimney. Not what I want. And we're going to fix it with the transform effect, sitting ahead of CC cylinder. That way I don't have to pre-comp to do this. And I'm just going to scale. I think I'll scale the whole thing like that. And that looks like an excellent starting point to me. Now to track the plate in After Effects, how novel, we're going to go to the layer view, and then my tracking controls happen to be open over here on the right, and so I'm just going to track motion. Now before I do this, there's one bit of prep I'll do because it's the proper way to do it, and that is just to add a null object. We could do this at any point, but I'm going to do it now while I'm thinking of it, and I'm being very thorough here, giving it a proper name and all. Okay, back to the track. So with the point tracker, what we're looking for is, I often describe it as a corner, something distinct that doesn't occur, anywhere adjacent. So for example, this detail up here looks pretty different from everything else around. Now the other thing to keep in mind is how much movement there is. Well, it's not a lot, but I would say that I should widen this out and widen out. So my target region and my feature region, outer and inner. I'm widening both of those out, and now I'm going to go ahead in the tracker. Only tracking position here. This is a 1-point track. Why don't we zoom out just so we can see what's going on. And it's done. Now I'm going to go the other direction. I'm not going to do anything but try to just track it. Let's see what happens. So this tracker had no problem with 1 frame of interruption. Bravo. Okay, I'm zoomed in here for a second to delve a little deeper into the After Effects point tracker. It's the oldest tracker in After Effects, doesn't get a lot of respect, but it is bloody useful in certain cases, this being one of them. So you heard me mention the feature region and the track area. I think those are the right terms. The feature region is this inner square, which I have scaled up so that I get a little bit more detail. I'm trying to show it some of the highlight and shadow areas here and all the detail. Basically, you're looking for something that has a definable edge, corner, something somewhere in there, and you want it to be unique from anything else that at least would be in the track region throughout the track. I've made my track region even a bit wider because the motion of the shot is left to right. I could offset it if I want. Notice, by the way, that if I try to do that, just grab the edge and I can do that. Doesn't affect my track. And then in the very center is this little crosshair, and that is the attach point. And that is separate from the feature center, although by default they're the same. So in my timeline, I'm getting the same numbers for both of those. And in between them, there's this confidence number, which I'll talk about in a second. But you can, and we will at some point, move the attach point so it's not the same as the feature center. In this case, we're fine with it. You can also move your track data around. Part of the reason that we sometimes apply the track data to a null is so that the track is independent from where we're actually placing our layer or object or element or whatever it is. But I think you get the idea that by default, I'm just getting tracking data that applies to this 1 point for a single point track. You can also do a 2-point track and get rotation and scale data. It's not what we're doing here. So then confidence is actual mathematical calculation of how much accuracy was detected in the frame. Now, in this case, the confidence is extremely high, other than on this one layer where my feature disappeared and confidence went to 0. But After Effects handled that just perfectly, and the way it handled that was determined in the track options. Now, since I didn't change these from the default, what it did was adapt the feature since the confidence went below the threshold of 80%. So for now, for this example, the default setting worked great. And of course I can change it, which we will do in a following example. There are controls in here that one could adjust if it weren't cooperating so well, but since it is, I'm going to take it. The one thing I have left to do over here is to change the target to be my null, and then apply that. There we go. And now let's go back to where we started, where my logo was in the right place. And that's the beauty of a null, is now I have to do is parent, no shift key, nothing, and the motion's there. And we got a little comping to do. We could use a little bit of motion blur. See what that does. Not a huge difference. Let's make it a little bigger. And let's see. So I'm free to repo this. Again, the beauty of a null is I can move it back and forth. I could scale it up just a smidgen. If I hold down the command key, then I'm scaling in increments of 0.1. That's pretty good. What was I trying to do again? Well, I know I got to color match the thing, so whatever I was about to do, let's do that. Now, this is a little arbitrary, how it should look. I think, you know, it's basically right, and it's just got to look, you know, like the whites belong in the scene. And they're not even that far off. In the blue channel, I don't see anything that bright. So let's do this with curves this time. So in blue, I could come down a bit. That's going to make it turn kind of green. So I can also go into green and do a similar thing, just less. And let's get where we can really see this. I mean, another way to do it would be just bring everything down and bring the red up. But I've already done it this way. And then let's just see what kind of overall contrast we want here. I think we might want it, I mean, I want it to pop, but yeah, it needs to pop, so I'm not going to do that. Let's just go with this, and before we try it in full motion, let's take care of this one thing. I'm going to be unorthodox with this one and do this in a way you probably didn't expect. So I'll set a keyframe for opacity here, and 1, 2 frames later, right there. And then we're just going to find the opacity level where this thing is believably behind. And let's check it out. Wow. Simple as that. So once again, I gotta say, it's pretty fun to cheat and get away with 2.5D. Now let's spend a little time talking about nightmare tracks. It's often the case that our eye can perfectly pick up motion, but the computer does not have what it needs. So here's an example where we have mostly, but not exclusively, horizontal motion. The camera's also bobbing up and down and rotating. And if it were just horizontal motion, I could probably just hit a start and end keyframe and be done with it. Additionally, there's just very little horizontal detail. I mean, there's plenty, but it's also blurry, that there's no continuity. And what is continuing is problematic. It's these reflections in the wall. Now, let's suppose I want to put my logo somewhere like right there, and the pole will pass across it. Well, I tried this before showing you, and the closest solution in this case to not just purely eyeballing it is to use the detail on the sidewalk, which is also pretty blurry, but at least consistent. So that's what I'm going to show you. So I'm showing you all the tricks to get your track to work, but really this is a pretty short track that you could conceivably eyeball pretty well. And I actually learned to animate in After Effects by doing hand tracking before there was actually a tracker built into After Effects, if you can imagine that. And this was on a game for LucasArts with full motion video that involved matching pilots who had been shot on a green screen. They're on a rig to move them around as if they're getting bumped, or if they get hit, they go flying. And the virtual cockpit had to match them. And there was probably a good half hour of footage like that that I matched every frame of by hand. And it was actually pretty damn fun. Now, it just so happens we're already in the layer panel, and I have the tracker panel open. So all I have to do is click track motion, and I get this teeny little tracker. If you've ever tried to drag this thing, you can easily grab the attach point by accident, like I just did, or end up kind of scaling it, which is actually more what you want. But if it doesn't work, just zoom in there and scale it up to where you can drag it, because you have to drag it kind of in the center here. It's an old tool. So now this is my detail area. I want my graffiti to be right above here. So I'm just going to carefully select the feature region, which I hopefully get a zoom on when I drag it around only, to have some clear defined outline areas. So what that means is I don't like this over here because I want to get to the edge of things. So let's go more like that. I don't know if that's necessary, but what I like are complete shapes with corners and so on. Hope that makes sense. And then for my feature area, which I just missed, I'm just going to make it wide enough, and I'll double check that, yeah, in a given frame to frame, I just want to make sure my feature is going to stay within that in both directions, because I'm starting in the middle, so I'm not going to offset it. Now, I could cautiously track this frame by frame with this analyze one frame backward and forward. I'm not going to do that. But one thing I wanted to point out is if I do that, each time it's going to start with a new feature. So it's going to reset the feature every time I restart the track. That's helpful sometimes when tracks go off the rails. If you wanted that behavior for some reason, you can go in options and say adapt feature on every frame. It's not what I want here. And from a zoomed out view, let's track forward to start with. Just a couple frames. Go back to the starting point. And let's see what happens now if I just go ahead and track backward. Ooh, that's looking pretty good until that pole came along. Now, we could solve this in several different ways. We could just delete these tracker frames, we could get rid of them. Notice that confidence goes down to 93.9 on that frame, and it had been at 97.7 on the previous one. I hope you're taking careful note of that. And it stays low after that, right? Because now it's lost. So my feature is back after the post crosses it. At this point, I could move the tracker over, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to try making the tracker do this properly. Let me undo. And this time, in the options, I'm going to change confidence to 95%. That's no magic number, although that may be where tracks fail, somewhere in there. And in this menu, I get to choose what happens if confidence goes below there. You can say just keep going. You could say stop and let me know that there's a problem. But here I'm going to try extrapolate motion. And by the way, while we're in here, the one other thing I haven't really gotten into is enhance before match. So here's a case where you might think, well, I could also probably make this better by blowing up the contrast in the shot. If you're feeling that, you could go ahead and check this. I don't find it actually makes a big difference, and I have not found that increasing contrast before you track really does in most cases either. But, you know, there are cases where you'll try anything, and you might find it actually works for you. I have not seen it. So let's try this again. Here comes the pole. And it looks like it succeeded this time. Let's see what actually happened. It kept going, which isn't so great. But now all I have to do is just delete the rest of those. We're good. Now, here's another little pro tip. In the previous track with the smokestack, I set a track null. And that's a normal way to do it. There is another thing you can do. So let's go right out. Let's say that I want my logo kind of sitting right out here in the middle of this shot. Like let's say mostly in the center of this frame right here. Okay. So what I can do is adjust the attach point offset, and I'm going to move it up on the Y. I'm doing this with the controls in the timeline because if I move the attach point itself, that's only going to move it on this one frame. I've already got keyframes for that. So this is specifically designed to let me offset this thing. And that's a pretty little known feature. If I had planned ahead, I could have also moved the attach point. Moving the attach point is also really handy if you end up having to join together a couple of tracks, like track two different features, but have them end up at the same keyframe or generate the same set of keyframes. I hope that makes sense. Let's just move on. So I will apply this. The target is always going to be the first layer, so it's applied already to graffiti. And let's take a look in the comp. All right. So that's looking really good once I get it to exit the frame. So we don't need these tracking keyframes anymore. Let's take a look at the position keyframes, and there they are. And it even helpfully left out a keyframe for that frame where it didn't know what to do. Amazing. So here's how we're going to complete this. On this end of the shot, we're already on the last frame of the video, but over here we need an entrance. So watch carefully, because this is another one of my top 5 most useful expressions in After Effects 4 visual effects. You may not have seen it before. So option click on the stopwatch to set the expression. I'll use the menu to select under property loop in. Now, as you might have guessed, loop in is going to loop in to the keyframes. Awesome. The only thing is, if I leave it at the default setting, what it's going to do is cycle those keyframes, not what I want. See that word cycle? Num keyframes lets me offset it, which I don't care about. So I'm going to delete everything in what's called the arguments. I know I hate arguments of this expression. These things in parentheses are called arguments. And we're going to double click this word. And then if I start typing, I happen to know that I'm going for continue. But if I didn't, I could get a full menu of all 4 of my options here just by being in between the quotations. And this does have to be in quotations, I know, expressions. So we're going to go continue. And for some reason, it's not letting me. Oh, I guess I have to press enter. There we go. And enter again to set that. And let's see what now happens. Ooh, awesome. Now, the other thing I noticed, the end, the motion blur goes away. And that's because there's no final keyframe. And that is an imaginary frame. So we could try to set another expression, but rather than do it that way, I'm just going to go brute force here and move it over. Actually, you know what would help? I'll just make this comp 1 frame longer for a second so I can see what I'm doing. And yeah. Now, of course, this is the equivalent of what loop in was doing, but loop in was doing it over a series of frames. So to tidy up, I can take this back to being a 24 frame comp. Thank you very much. Now I have motion blur. Let's take a look at the graph editor just to see what loop in was doing. And you can't really actually see this because, well, okay, here you can. So what loop in is doing is taking these 2 frames and continuing them, although I have to say it's really hard to see that here. Oh, here's why. I also have to enable this little button. Okay, now, now I can see that my X movement is being continued perfectly, but so is the Y, and it's using the previous set of keyframes to do that. And that's what that little offset thing in the expression allowed me to change. But by default, it's using those 2. Just what I wanted. Now again, you would not be dead in the water if you didn't know this expression. But it's so handy and so simple, really, that I kind of encourage you to just learn it. I know expression is one of those things where it feels like, oh my God, I'm going to have to take a whole course and learn them before I can use them. But actually, the basic thing here was command, parentheses, quotations around the thing you want to do, the argument. And that's it. And the thing you want to do almost always in VFX is a loop in or loop out continue between the parentheses and quotation marks. And that's all you have to know. And if you want to do some of the other loops, you can do those too. They're pretty handy for other kinds of animation. Having taken care of that, we can close the graph editor and the tracker panel and get some screen real estate back to do the comping. We'll take care of the poll in a moment too. Looks perfect, but let's see if we can improve it. Well, I'm going to have to take care of the color, but before I do that, I can see that I really want the paint to just show up on the bricks and not on the mortar. So let's name our background layer plate and duplicate it and call this one matte and move it to the top. Command Shift right square bracket and set that as the Luma inverted matte, and that doesn't do much until I adjust it. So with that layer selected, the levels effect, I'll just come down on the white point and let's find our sweet spot. So I'm adjusting the luminance of the matte, which is a Luma matte, for how much I want to let through here. And really, I don't want to actually be making comping decisions here. So I'm just trying to get the grout at around the right level. Looks good. So now let's color match this logo, also with levels. Green channel looks okay. Red channel, let's see my full frame. Looks okay. Blue channel, whoa. Overall, I would say that the logo is very bright, and in the red channel, that is pretty apparent. So overall, I'm going to take down its output black level, make it look more kind of old and faded. And the missing blue channel, let's see if I want to do anything with that. I'm actually going to keep watching as I do this. I don't know that there's particularly a color cast here. I don't think that's the issue. So this being graffiti, it's not so much that it matches anything in the shot, but let's look at those black levels, because I came down on the output white, but I think we have to lift the blacks a bit too, because they're just looking blacker than anything else. Yeah, that's starting to look good. Well, there's plenty of room to make this however you want it, depending on how old you think this logo is, but I'm pretty satisfied for the moment. And now for the poll. I know you want me to show you some magical way to track something that is a complete blur. We're not going to do that. And we're going to brute force this baby. So we're going to get our pen tool, make 4 corners and have them go right out of frame. Oh, it's not happy with me doing that. Okay, in frame, fine. We'll move them after. I'm going right down the middle of the blurry area. Move that up, down. We're working with some pretty ancient After Effects tools here. So, something like that, nobody's ever gonna see this. Okay, well, they'll see if it is wrong. Okay, so then, that's my starting point. And we'll take it to where we can see it here. And it's changing its shape a little bit. I guess I could humor you by rotating it slightly. And actually, I want one more frame, just so we can exit. Doesn't matter where it is, because we're just going for motion blur. Speaking of, turn on motion blur for that. Now remember, if you turn on motion blur with a heavily blurred object and you see it move, which I did not, do go into your comp settings and double check that the shutter phase is -1/2 of the shutter angle. We didn't see anything because the layer was turned off. Let's turn it on. Ooh, and let's see what we got. A masterpiece. We've already used Mocha quite a bit in this course, and it's kind of funny to me that this is the first that we've really gotten around to actually doing planar tracking and matching objects that way with it, which is kind of what it's known for doing. So we looked at a whole variety of things that you can do with it for tracking one layer to match another. So there's not just planar or corner pin tracking, but there's also just transforms. You can just use transform data. You can also use the After Effects point tracker for that, and sometimes the immediacy or the ability to just get in there and control it in a really direct way can make it the right tool for the job. One thing that I don't really use much anymore is the corner pin tracker in After Effects. So to me, Mocha has pretty much totally superseded that. I haven't really come up against cases where I would want to go back to that, because basically what it does is take all the variables that you have with one point and multiply it by 4, and they don't know anything about each other. Whereas the beauty of Mocha, as we have now seen in more lessons than this one, is that it can conceive of an area of a shot as being a unified plane and not really care so much about specific points. All right, well, that's going to wrap it up for this lesson, and I think this stuff is really fun, and I hope you have fun with it too.